When substitute teacher Sarah Mitchell walked into room 237 at Hawkins Middle School, she thought the hardest part would be managing seventh graders. She never expected to watch them literally grow younger before her eyes, losing months of development with each passing day, until she realized the horrifying truth about what the school was really hiding. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories. Before we begin this chilling tale of supernatural mystery, impossible science, and the moment when a teacher discovered that some lessons can't be found in any textbook, tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed something that everyone else seemed to ignore? And if you believe stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. This story will show you that sometimes the most terrifying discoveries happen in the most ordinary places. Sarah Mitchell had been a substitute teacher for 15 years, which meant she had seen everything. At 38, she had developed the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing she could walk into any classroom and maintain order while actually educating children. So when the call came in at 6:30 a.m. on a Monday morning in October, asking if she could take a long-term assignment at Hawkins Middle School, Sarah didn't hesitate. The regular teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had been hospitalized with what the principal described as complications from a stress-related illness, and they needed someone who could step in for at least 6 weeks. Hawkins was a small town about an hour outside Indianapolis, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing exciting ever happened. Sarah had substituted there a few times over the years and remembered it as a typical Midwestern community. The middle school building was a classic example of 1960s institutional architecture, long corridors lined with pale green lockers and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. Room 237 was located at the end of the math and science wing, far enough from the main office that Sarah knew she'd be largely left alone. The students were seventh graders, 12 and 13 years old, that awkward age when children were caught between childhood and adolescence. Sarah had always found this age group challenging but rewarding. What struck Sarah immediately about this particular class was how normal they seemed. In her experience, classes that had gone through multiple substitute teachers usually showed signs of stress or behavioral problems. But the 22 students in room 237 appeared remarkably well-adjusted. They filed into class that first Monday morning with orderly behavior that most teachers spent weeks trying to establish. They sat quietly while Sarah introduced herself, responded politely when she asked them to share their names, and transitioned smoothly into their first lesson without any chaos. Tommy Henderson raised his hand to answer questions about cellular biology. Jessica Brennan offered to help distribute materials. Marcus Johnson volunteered to clean the whiteboard. After 30 minutes, Sarah thought this might be the most pleasant long-term assignment she'd ever taken. The students seemed like a typical cross-section of seventh graders. There was the quiet girl in the back corner, the class clown, the best friends passing notes, the athlete checking the clock, and the overachiever taking notes on everything. Their previous work, displayed around the room, showed genuine academic achievement. Science projects demonstrated curiosity about how the world worked. Creative writing revealed thoughtful, imaginative minds. Art projects showed developing skills and creative expression. But it was during her second day that Sarah noticed the first thing that didn't quite make sense. She was reviewing the attendance roster when she realized that several students looked younger than she remembered from the previous day. Tommy Henderson, who had seemed to be hitting an early growth spurt, appeared shorter. Jessica Brennan's face looked rounder, less defined by the angular bone structure of early adolescence. Sarah told herself she was imagining things. After 15 years of working with children, she knew that lighting, posture, and clothing choices could dramatically affect how old a student appeared. But by Wednesday, Sarah was certain something was wrong. Tommy Henderson's voice, which had been cracking with early puberty on Monday, was now consistently higher pitched. When Sarah asked him to read aloud, He sounded like he had reverted to an 11-year-old rather than the 13-year-old listed on his enrollment information. Jessica Brennan had been wearing a bra on Monday. Sarah had noticed because the girl kept adjusting her posture. By Wednesday, her silhouette suggested she no longer needed that undergarment. Marcus Johnson had been one of the taller students, suggesting the beginning of a growth spurt. But when Sarah had him present his project Wednesday afternoon, he was noticeably shorter than he had been just 2 days earlier. The changes were subtle enough that Sarah might have dismissed them individually, but collectively they created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Her students weren't just behaving younger, they were physically becoming younger. That Wednesday evening, Sarah sat in her apartment grading papers and trying to convince herself that she was losing her mind. But when she looked at the work her students had turned in, she noticed something else that made her stomach tighten. The handwriting was changing. Tommy Henderson's assignment from Monday showed developing fine motor skills and growing confidence. His work from Wednesday looked like it had been completed by someone with less developed hand coordination, larger letters, inconsistent spacing, overall presentation suggesting a younger child's approach. Jessica Brennan's essay about her favorite book had been sophisticated on Monday, demonstrating analytical thinking. Her Wednesday assignment was simpler, more concrete, less nuanced. Sarah spread the assignments out on her kitchen table and stared at them for nearly an hour. Maybe the students were playing an elaborate prank. Maybe this was some kind of psychological experiment. But the more Sarah examined the evidence, the more convinced she became that something genuinely impossible was happening in room 237. Her students were aging backwards. Thursday morning, Sarah arrived at school an hour early, determined to document what she was observing. She set up her phone discreetly to record the students entering the classroom, hoping video evidence might help her understand whether the changes were real. The students filed in with their usual calm demeanor, but Sarah was now watching them with detective-like intensity. Tommy Henderson was definitely shorter than he had been on Monday, at least 2 inches shorter. His face had lost the angular definition of approaching adolescence and returned to the rounder, softer features of childhood. Jessica Brennan moved with unconscious ease of someone whose body was becoming more familiar rather than less so. The awkwardness of early adolescence had been replaced by confident physicality of someone whose growth was moving in reverse. Marcus Johnson's voice had completed its regression from unpredictable cracking back to the clear, high tones of a child who had not yet experienced hormonal changes. But it wasn't just physical development that was reversing. Sarah began to notice changes in behavior and cognitive processing that suggested her. Students were literally becoming younger versions of themselves. During their science lesson Thursday, Sarah asked the class to discuss ethical implications of genetic engineering, a topic they had engaged with thoughtfully earlier in the week. But their responses now lacked the nuanced thinking she had observed just days before. Their arguments were simpler, more black and white, less capable of considering multiple perspectives. When she assigned creative writing, asking them to imagine themselves as adults, their responses revealed thinking patterns becoming increasingly concrete rather than abstract. Instead of sophisticated understanding of how education and choice might shape futures, they wrote about wanting to be firefighters, astronauts, and princesses, career aspirations of much younger children. During lunch, Sarah approached the conversation carefully, asking other teachers if they had noticed anything unusual about room 237. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson's class?" said Mr. Peterson, who taught 8th grade social studies. "They're good kids. A little young for their grade level, maybe, but good kids." "Young for their grade level?" Sarah pressed. "What do you mean?" "Just their behavior, their maturity level. They seem more like 6th graders than 7th graders sometimes. But Henderson always said they were a bit behind developmentally." Sarah felt a chill. How long has Mrs. Henderson been their teacher? This is her 2nd year with them. She had them in 6th grade last year, too. Really dedicated teacher. She requested to move up with them because she felt they needed continuity. And you've noticed them seeming younger this year than last year. Mr. Peterson shrugged. Kids develop at different rates. Henderson always said this group was immature for their age, but she was confident they'd catch up eventually. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home, she went to the main office and asked to speak with Principal Walsh about her concerns. Principal Walsh was a pleasant woman in her 50s who had been running Hawkins Middle School for nearly a decade. She had the kind of calm confidence that suggested she had dealt with every possible crisis. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, gesturing for Sarah to sit, "how are you settling in? The students seem to be responding well to you." "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss," Sarah said carefully. "I've noticed some things about the students that concern me." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation, trying to find a way to express her observations without sounding insane. The students seem to be regressing developmentally. Their physical appearance, their cognitive abilities, their emotional maturity. Everything seems to be moving backward rather than forward. Principal Walsh's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had raised these concerns. "Can you be more specific?" Walsh asked. Tommy Anderson was definitely taller on Monday than he is today. Jessica Brennan's handwriting and analytical thinking have become noticeably less sophisticated over just 4 days. Marcus Johnson's voice has lost all traces of puberty. It's as if they're aging in reverse. Principal Walsh was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the kind of attention that suggested she was deciding how much truth she could afford to share. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said finally, "I'm going to ask you to trust me when I tell you that everything happening in room 237 is part of a carefully monitored educational program. The students are safe, their families are fully informed, and what you're observing is temporary." "What kind of educational program involves children aging backwards?" "The kind that requires absolute confidentiality and complete cooperation from substitute teachers who want to continue working in this district." The threat was delivered so smoothly that it took Sarah a moment to realize what had just happened. Principal Walsh had confirmed that Sarah's observations were correct, while simultaneously warning her not to pursue the matter further. "You're telling me that you know the students are aging backwards, and you're asking me to pretend it's normal?" "I'm telling you that there are aspects of education in this district that require a level of security clearance you don't possess. I'm asking you to do your job, teach your lessons, and trust that adults with more information are handling the situation appropriately." Sarah felt anger rising. These are children. If something is happening to them that affects their development, their parents have a right to know. The authorities have a right to know. "Their parents do know," Principal Walsh said calmly, "and the appropriate authorities are already involved. What they don't need is a substitute teacher creating panic about a situation she doesn't understand. Then help me understand it." "I can't do that. But I can tell you that if you continue to ask questions or share your observations with anyone outside this office, your employment with this district will be terminated immediately, and we will ensure that no other district in the state will hire you." Sarah stared at the principal, realizing that she had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple educational anomaly. That evening, Sarah sat in her car in the school parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do next. Every instinct told her that she couldn't simply ignore what she was witnessing, but every practical consideration warned her that pursuing the matter further could destroy her career and possibly put her in physical danger. Finally, she made a decision that would define the rest of her time in Hawkins. She was going to find out what was really happening to her students, regardless of the consequences. That night, Sarah began researching everything she could find about Hawkins, Indiana. What she discovered was a pattern of strangeness that stretched back decades, hidden beneath the surface of a town that worked very hard to appear completely normal. Hawkins had been the site of numerous government research projects since the 1950s, most connected to a facility called Hawkins National Laboratory. While officially dedicated to energy research, declassified documents suggested involvement in psychological research, pharmaceutical testing, and experiments that pushed the boundaries of conventional science. The middle school had been built in 1963, just 3 years after the establishment of the National Laboratory. School board records showed unusual patterns of federal funding for educational programs never clearly described in public documents. There were references to advanced learning initiatives, developmental research opportunities, and cognitive enhancement protocols that sounded more like scientific experiments than traditional education. More troubling were the medical records Sarah accessed through her teacher portal. Students in certain classes showed patterns of development that didn't match normal childhood growth curves. Heights and weights that fluctuated in ways that defied biological possibility. Cognitive test scores that improved and declined in cycles, suggesting external intervention rather than natural learning progression. But it was the photographs that provided the most compelling evidence that something impossible was happening at Hawkins Middle School. Sarah found yearbook photos dating back 5 years, showing the same group of students she was currently teaching. But instead of normal progression from childhood to adolescence, these pictures showed something that made Sarah's hands shake. The students were aging backwards. In the oldest photos, they looked like normal 8th graders, taller, more mature, showing physical and emotional development appropriate for 13 and 14-year-olds. Each subsequent year, they appeared younger, smaller, less developed. The most recent photos showed them looking like the 11 and 12-year-olds they appeared to be now. But according to their enrollment records, they should be 15 or 16 years old. Sarah printed the photos and spread them across her kitchen table, arranging them chronologically to document the impossible transformation. What she saw was a group of children caught in some kind of temporal loop, aging in reverse while maintaining their memories and basic personalities. The next morning, Sarah arrived at school with a plan. She was going to document everything about the students' condition while trying to understand the mechanism causing their reverse aging. During science class, she assigned a project requiring students to measure and record their own physical statistics, height, weight, hand span, and other metrics that would change noticeably if they continued aging backwards. She presented it as a long-term study of adolescent development, but her real goal was to create objective data proving what was happening. She also began paying closer attention to the students' conversations, looking for clues about their understanding of their own condition. What she discovered was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The students knew what was happening to them. During lunch period, Sarah overheard Jessica Brennan talking about not being able to reach the high shelf anymore. Tommy Henderson mentioned to Marcus Johnson that his clothes were getting too big. Several students made casual references to things they used to be able to do that suggested capabilities they had recently lost. But they spoke about these changes with resigned acceptance that suggested they had been living with this reality for so long that it had become normal. They weren't panicked or confused. They were adapting the way children adapt to any circumstance that adults tell them is necessary. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would put her in direct conflict with the school administration. She was going to talk to the students directly about what was happening. She waited until after the final bell, when most other teachers had left. Then she asked Tommy Henderson, Jessica Brennan, and Marcus Johnson to stay after class for what she described as a make-up assignment. When the 3 students were seated in front of her desk, Sarah took a deep breath and asked the question that had been haunting her for a week. How long have you been getting younger? The students exchanged glances with the kind of silent communication that suggested they had been expecting this conversation. Since 6th grade, Jessica said quietly. Maybe a little before that. Do you know why it's happening? The doctor said it was temporary, Tommy replied. They said it was part of a treatment to help us. Treatment for what? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. We're not supposed to talk about it. Our parents said it could be dangerous if the wrong people found out. What kind of dangerous? The kind where people try to stop the treatment before it's finished, Jessica said. The doctor said there are people who don't understand what they're doing and might try to interfere. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the magnitude of what these children had been subjected to. Are you in any pain? Are you scared? Sometimes, Tommy admitted. It's weird not being able to do things you could do before. And people treat you different when you look younger. But Dr. Brenner said it would all go back to normal when the treatment is done, Marcus added. We just have to be patient. Dr. Brenner? The students went quiet, and Sarah could see they realized they had shared more information than they were supposed to. We should go home, Jessica said, standing up quickly. Our parents will be worried if we're late. As the students gathered their belongings and headed for the door, Sarah called after them. If anything happens, if you need help, or if you're scared, you can talk to me. I promise I'll listen. Tommy Henderson turned back to look at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his increasingly young face. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell, but there's nothing you can do to help us. There's nothing anyone can do until the experiment is over. Sarah's answer came the next morning when she arrived at school to find that 3 of her students were missing. Tommy Henderson, Jessica Brennan, and Marcus Johnson, the 3 children she had spoken with after class the previous day, were not in their seats when the bell rang. When Sarah checked with the office, she was told that they had been transferred to a special program and would not be returning to her classroom. The remaining students seemed confused by their classmates' sudden absence, but none appeared surprised. When Sarah asked if anyone knew where Tommy, Jessica, and Marcus had gone, the students exchanged meaningful glances. They went to the next part, said Emily Carter, a quiet girl who rarely spoke in class. What's the next part? Sarah asked. Emily looked toward the door, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, then leaned forward and whispered, When you get too young, they take you to the lab until you're ready to start over. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. Start over with what? But Emily had already withdrawn into herself, clearly regretting that she had shared even that much information. During lunch, Sarah made a decision that she knew would change her life forever. She was going to find those 3 children, and she was going to expose whatever was being done to them. That afternoon, instead of going home, Sarah drove to the Hawkins National Laboratory. The facility was larger than she had expected, sprawling across several acres of heavily wooded land outside town. The main building was a stark, modernist structure, but the high fences, security cameras, and armed guards suggested that whatever happened inside was considered highly sensitive. Sarah parked across the street and watched the facility for nearly 2 hours. She saw researchers and technicians entering and leaving through a heavily monitored checkpoint. She observed delivery trucks bringing equipment that was carefully inspected before being allowed through the gates. But she also saw something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. School buses. 3 different school buses left the facility during the time Sarah was watching, each carrying children who appeared to be elementary school age. But there was something wrong with the children's behavior. They moved with careful coordination of people who were much older than they appeared, and they watched their surroundings with alertness that suggested they understood they were in a dangerous situation. As the 3rd bus pulled away from the facility, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She was going to follow it. The bus traveled through residential neighborhoods, stopping periodically to drop off children at houses where adults were waiting. But these weren't normal school bus stops. The adults who met the children looked like parents, but their interactions lacked casual familiarity of families reuniting after a school day. Instead, there was a formal, almost clinical quality that suggested these people were following a carefully rehearsed protocol. Sarah followed the bus to 4 different stops, documenting what she observed with her phone. At each location, she saw children who appeared to be 6 or 7 years old being delivered to adults who treated them with the kind of cautious respect typically reserved for much older individuals. The bus's final stop was a house Sarah recognized from her research. It was the address listed for Jessica Brennan's family. Sarah watched from her car as a girl who appeared to be about 7 years old stepped off the bus and walked toward the front door with measured dignity that seemed completely incongruous with her apparent age. The woman who answered the door greeted her with a mixture of relief and sadness that suggested this was a reunion that had been both anticipated and dreaded. As the little girl who had once been Jessica Brennan disappeared into the house, Sarah finally understood the full scope of what was happening in Hawkins. The children weren't just aging backwards. They were being cycled through their childhoods repeatedly, their memories and personalities preserved while their physical forms regressed to infancy before beginning the process again. They were trapped in a temporal loop that allowed researchers to study human development from multiple angles, while ensuring that the subjects never aged out of usefulness. The next morning, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She was going to save the children who were still in her classroom, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. Sarah's plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She was going to evacuate the remaining students from Hawkins Middle School and take them somewhere safe while she contacted federal authorities, who might be able to shut down the experiment. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived at school with a carefully prepared story about a special field trip that required the entire class to leave the building immediately. She had researched the school's emergency protocols and knew that teachers had authority to evacuate students if they believed there was an immediate safety concern. "Everyone needs to line up quietly and follow me to the parking lot," Sarah announced as soon as the morning bell rang. "We're taking an unexpected trip today, and I need everyone to stay together and listen carefully to my instructions." The students responded with calm compliance she had come to expect from them, but she could see questions in their eyes. They had been through enough unusual experiences that they recognized when something significant was happening. Sarah led her class through the corridors of Hawkins Middle School, past other classrooms where normal education was taking place, toward the exit that would take them to freedom. With each step, she expected to be stopped by administrators who had realized what she was attempting. But the hallways remained quiet, and no one challenged their progress. It wasn't until they reached the parking lot that Sarah realized her plan had a fatal flaw. Principal Walsh was waiting for them, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who were clearly not part of the school's regular staff. "Mrs. Mitchell," Walsh said calmly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about today's schedule. These gentlemen would like to have a word with you." Sarah looked at her students, who were watching the confrontation with resigned acceptance that suggested they had witnessed similar scenes before. "It's okay, Mrs. Mitchell," said Emily Carter, the quiet girl who had tried to warn her. "You tried to help us. That's more than most people do." One of the men in suits stepped forward with professional courtesy that was somehow more threatening than overt aggression. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us. There are some questions about your recent activities that require clarification." Sarah realized she had 2 choices: cooperate and hope she could find another way to help the children, or resist and guarantee she would never see them again. She chose cooperation, but not surrender. "I want to make a statement," she said clearly, speaking loud enough that anyone within hearing distance would understand. "These children are being subjected to illegal medical experimentation." The man in the suit smiled with patient tolerance typically reserved for people who are clearly delusional. "Ma'am, I think you've been under a lot of stress lately. Why don't we go somewhere quiet where you can rest and talk through whatever concerns you might have?" As Sarah was escorted toward a black sedan that had appeared in the parking lot, She looked back at her students one final time. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell returned to her apartment in Indianapolis with no clear memory of why she had taken a leave of absence from substitute teaching. Her doctors explained that she had suffered a stress-related breakdown that had required intensive treatment, but the details remained frustratingly unclear. Sometimes, late at night, she would dream about children aging backwards and schools that hid impossible secrets. But when she woke up, the dreams faded like morning mist, leaving only a vague sense of unease and the feeling that she had forgotten something important. She never returned to substitute teaching. Instead, she took a job at a small college, working with education majors preparing to become teachers. She found herself emphasizing the importance of advocating for students, questioning authority when children's welfare was at stake, and remembering that some lessons couldn't be found in any textbook. Her students appreciated her passion, but they sometimes found her warnings about the dangers of complacency strangely intense for someone discussing routine. Educational challenges. If Sarah had been able to remember what happened in Hawkins, she might have taken comfort in knowing that her brief time in room 237 had planted seeds that would eventually grow into something powerful. The children she had tried to save never forgot the substitute teacher who had seen through the illusion and had been brave enough to try to help them. And when the opportunity finally came for them to escape the cycle that had trapped them, they remembered her lessons about questioning authority and thinking for themselves. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories, where we remember that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary people who refuse to look away when confronted with extraordinary evil. Some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. Some truths are too powerful to speak aloud. But some teachers care too much about their students to let anything, even the impossible, stand in the way of doing what's right.